Luke Bennett watched the train pull into Iron Creek Station, but it wasn't the woman stepping off the last passenger car that made him freeze. It was the small metal box she refused to let out of her sight. The train whistle echoed across the snowy valley as Ruth Harper stepped onto the platform, clutching a dented tin box against her chest. Steam curled around her boots. Luke reached for her suitcase, but she tightened her grip on the box instead. A cold wind rattled the station sign overhead. Neither of them smiled. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Luke noticed something strange. A faded receipt sticking out from beneath the lid, as if she had opened it only moments before arriving. He had agreed to marry a stranger, but what exactly had she brought with her to Iron Creek? If you're curious what was hidden inside that box, stay with us and share where you're watching from. The train whistle echoed across Iron Creek Basin long before the locomotive appeared. Luke Bennett stood near the end of the platform with his hands in his coat pockets. Wind pushed dust across the tracks and rattled a loose sign hanging from the freight office. A few ranch hands waited for supplies. A woman carrying mail stepped off a wagon. Nobody paid much attention to him. That was fine. He had not come for a celebration. He had come to meet his wife. The thought still felt strange. The train rolled into the station with a hiss of steam. Doors opened. Passengers stepped down one by one. Then he saw her. A dark-skinned woman in a plain brown traveling coat. One worn suitcase. One small tin box held carefully against her side. She looked around once before her eyes found him. Neither smiled. Neither waved. Luke removed his hat. "Miss Harper?" "Yes." Her voice was calm. "I'm Luke Bennett." She nodded once. No awkward excitement followed. No romance. No grand beginning. Just two people standing beside a train, both hoping they had not made a mistake. The ride to the ranch took nearly 2 hours. Gray hills stretched beneath a cold Wyoming sky. Fence lines crossed the valley. Small patches of snow remained in shaded places where winter had not completely let go. Ruth sat quietly beside him in the wagon. Luke spoke only when necessary. "The creek floods in spring," she nodded. "The north pasture gets rough during storms." Another nod. The silence between them was not hostile, only unfamiliar. As sunset painted the distant rocks copper red, the Bennett Ranch came into view. A weathered house, a large barn, several corrals, a windmill turning slowly above a water tank. Ruth studied everything without comment. When they stopped near the porch, a tall man stepped from the barn. Amos Bennett. His eyes moved from Luke to Ruth, then back again. "So she came," Amos said. Luke ignored the remark. "This is Ruth." Amos offered a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "Welcome to Iron Creek." Something about the way he said it made Ruth hold her tin box a little tighter. Inside, the house felt larger than it looked from outside, and colder. The kitchen was clean but empty of life. One chair sat near the stove. One coffee cup rested beside a ledger book. Everything looked arranged for a man living alone. Luke carried her suitcase upstairs. He stopped at a small room overlooking the corrals. "There are extra blankets in the chest." Ruth stepped inside. The room was simple, but it was hers. Luke handed her a brass key. "For the room?" "For the house." Ruth looked at him. Luke shifted slightly, uncomfortable beneath the attention. "You don't owe me anything except the truth." For the first time, something softened in her expression. "That's fair," she said. Later that night, long after the lamps were lit, Amos stood alone in the ranch office. He opened a drawer. Inside lay account books and unpaid invoices. His gaze stopped on a line written beside an old cattle feed order. Then he remembered what Luke had said. She used to keep books. Slowly, Amos closed the ledger. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows. Upstairs, Ruth placed her tin box beside the bed. Inside were receipts, letters, and records from another life. The next morning, while searching for a place to put away supplies, she would open one of the ranch ledgers and discover that a large payment meant for winter cattle feed had vanished without explanation. Ruth stared at the ledger for several seconds. Morning light fell through the office window, stretching across the desk where the account books were stacked. Outside, she could hear the distant clank of a gate and the low calls of cattle being moved between corrals. She turned the page, then back again. The numbers didn't fit. A payment of nearly $400 had been recorded 6 months earlier. The receipt number was listed. The supplier's name was listed. But there was no matching delivery. No invoice. No follow-up record. Nothing. Ruth closed the book slowly. She had spent too many years balancing accounts not to recognize a hole when she saw one. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. By the time she entered the kitchen, Luke had already left for the south pasture. A coffee cup sat beside the stove, half empty, a small detail. But she noticed it. The house seemed to carry traces of a man who moved through it without ever really living in it. That afternoon, she rolled up her sleeves and began working. The kitchen shelves were reorganized. The flour sacks were moved away from a drafty corner. Old jars were labeled. A broken cupboard hinge was repaired with a spare nail she found in the barn. Nobody had asked her to do any of it. She simply could not stand watching useful things fall apart. Near sunset, Nate Dawson stepped through the kitchen door carrying a crate of horseshoes. The young cowboy stopped short. "You baked?" Ruth glanced toward the cooling bread on the table. "Looks that way." Nate laughed. "I haven't smelled fresh bread in this house since—" He stopped himself. "Since when?" He scratched the back of his neck. "Since Luke's mother passed." The room grew quiet. Ruth looked down at the loaf. She had not known that. Nate seemed to realize he had said too much. He grabbed a piece of bread anyway. The moment he bit into it, his eyes widened. "Lord." Ruth couldn't help smiling. "That good?" "Ma'am, if the cattle smell this, they'll walk into town and sell themselves." His voice carried out through the open window. A few minutes later, 2 more ranch hands appeared, then another. Before long, the kitchen that usually sat silent was filled with boots scraping wood floors and men arguing over the last slice. Luke arrived after dark. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots. When he opened the door, he stopped. The lamp was lit. The stove was warm. Voices filled the kitchen. For a second, he looked genuinely confused. Nate grinned. "You're late." Luke looked around. At the bread, at the coffee pot, at Ruth standing near the stove. Something flickered across his face, gone almost immediately. But she saw it. He sat down quietly. A plate was already waiting. He looked at it, then at her. "You didn't have to." "No," Ruth said, "but I was already cooking." Luke nodded once. Nothing more. Yet he ate every bite. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with coffee brewing before sunrise. Ruth spent hours reviewing accounts between chores. Luke worked the ranch. Evenings ended with meals shared across the same table. Not conversations. Not exactly. Just small exchanges. Weather. Feed deliveries. Fence repairs. Enough to fill the silence without forcing it. And somehow, the silence changed. One afternoon, Ruth rode into Iron Creek with Luke to purchase supplies. The town sat beneath a wide Wyoming sky. Wagons lined the main street. Horses stood tied outside the mercantile. A bell rang from the blacksmith's shop. As they crossed toward the livestock market, conversations slowed. People looked. Not openly, just long enough to notice. Ruth had seen those looks before in other towns. She kept walking. Near the auction pens stood Clara Whitfield. Elegant gloves, dark blue dress, perfect posture. The sort of woman who knew exactly how much influence she carried. Her eyes settled on Ruth, then moved to Luke. So it's true. Luke's expression hardened slightly. Clara smiled. The smile never reached her eyes. I heard you brought home a bride from somewhere east. Ruth stood quietly. Clara continued. I suppose people do all sorts of things when they're running out of options. The nearby conversations faded. Several people pretended not to listen, which only made the moment louder. Ruth kept her shoulders straight. She had learned long ago that dignity often sounded quieter than pride. Before she could respond, Luke spoke. His voice was calm, but firm. Careful, Clara. The widow blinked. Luke rarely corrected anyone, especially not in public. Excuse me? My wife deserves the same respect as anyone standing here. The words landed harder than shouting would have. A long silence followed. Clara's expression changed. Only slightly. Enough. Without another word, she turned and walked away. The crowd slowly returned to its business. Ruth looked at Luke. He adjusted the brim of his hat, avoiding her eyes, as though defending her had been the most ordinary thing in the world. That night, long after everyone else slept, Ruth sat in the ranch office again. The lamp burned low. The ledger remained open. She turned another page, then froze. A section near the middle had been torn out, cleanly, deliberately. Someone had removed an entire sheet. The missing page sat directly between two questionable transactions. Ruth stared at the jagged edge. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows. Inside, the room suddenly felt much colder. Someone knew she was looking, and someone did not want her to keep reading. Ruth ran her fingers along the torn edge of the ledger page. The missing sheet had not fallen out. It had been removed carefully. The lamp burned low beside her. Outside, the wind moved across Iron Creek Basin with a long, hollow sound. She closed the book. For now, she said nothing. The next morning, life at the ranch continued as if nothing had happened. Luke rode out before sunrise. Nate repaired a section of fencing near the creek. Amos spent most of the day moving between the barn and the office, watching more than he worked. Ruth noticed. She also noticed something else. Every time she entered the office, Amos seemed to find a reason to appear nearby. A question. A comment. A glance toward the ledger shelf. Nothing she could prove. Enough to remember. Winter arrived early that year. By late November, gray clouds hung over the mountains for days at a time. One morning, Luke saddled 2 horses before daylight. We need to check the north grazing cabins before the storm hits. Ruth looked toward the western ridge. The sky carried the color of cold iron. I'll come. Luke hesitated. The wind tugged at her coat. Finally, he nodded. The ride north took nearly 3 hours. Snow began as scattered flakes drifting through the air. By noon, it was falling hard. The mountains disappeared behind a curtain of white. The cabin stood alone among low pines and frozen grass. By the time they reached it, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Luke secured the horses while Ruth carried supplies inside. The cabin was small. 1 stove, 1 table, 1 narrow bed against the wall. The storm arrived fully before sunset. Snow struck the windows. Wind pushed against the roof. The world beyond the cabin vanished. For the first time since their marriage began, there was nowhere else either of them could go. The fire crackled softly. Luke sat at the table repairing a leather strap. Ruth mended a torn glove beside the stove. Hours passed. The silence felt different here. Not empty, just close. The storm outside seemed to pull the room inward. At some point, Luke spoke without looking up. There was someone once. Ruth paused. He rarely talked about himself. My fiancé. The leather strap remained in his hands. She left 3 weeks before the wedding. The wind rattled the cabin walls. Luke gave a faint smile. Not a happy one. A banker from Cheyenne came through town. He owned more land than I ever would. Ruth said nothing. Luke continued. I spent a long time thinking I wasn't enough. The fire popped. A spark rose and vanished. After a while, Ruth set down the glove. I know what that feels like. Luke finally looked at her. The lamp cast soft shadows across the room. She told him about the hotel, about missing money, about accusations, about watching people she'd worked beside for years avoid her eyes. They never proved anything, she said quietly, but nobody wanted to wait for the truth. Luke's jaw tightened slightly. Neither spoke again for several minutes. The storm filled the silence. Somewhere after midnight, the fire burned low. The room grew colder. Without discussion, Luke added another log. Without discussion, Ruth poured coffee from the kettle. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away immediately. The moment lasted only a second. Still, something shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. The storm finally weakened near dawn. Morning light filtered through the frosted window. The world outside looked untouched. White hills, white fences, white sky. They returned to the ranch that afternoon. A fresh stack of mail waited near the front door. Ruth sorted through it absent-mindedly, then stopped. One envelope carried the seal of a large hotel in Cheyenne. She opened it slowly, read the letter once, then again. Luke stepped into the kitchen carrying firewood. He noticed the paper in her hands. He noticed her expression. He did not ask questions. Ruth folded the letter carefully. A management position, triple the salary, housing provided, a chance to begin again somewhere larger than Iron Creek, somewhere safer, somewhere easier. Luke placed the firewood beside the stove. His eyes lingered on the envelope for only a moment. Then he turned away. No questions. No request for her to stay. No argument. Nothing. That silence somehow felt heavier than words. And for the first time since arriving at the Bennett Ranch, Ruth found herself wishing he had said something. Days passed. The letter from Cheyenne remained folded inside her tin box. She did not answer it. Not yet. Each morning she woke before sunrise, lit the stove and brewed coffee while darkness still covered the valley. The smell drifted through the house the same way it always had. Luke came downstairs. He drank from the same chipped mug. He thanked her. He spoke about cattle prices, weather, and fence repairs. Never once about the letter. The omission sat between them like a third person at the table. Outside, winter tightened its grip on Iron Creek Basin. The grass had vanished beneath frost. Thin ice formed along the creek banks. The mountains looked closer somehow, their gray slopes buried beneath fresh snow. Luke worked longer hours. Sometimes he left before dawn. Sometimes he returned after dark. Ruth watched him through the kitchen window more than once, his figure crossing the yard, his shoulders bent against the wind, his hat pulled low, always moving, always busy, as if work might solve something words could not. One evening, Nate arrived carrying a stack of invoices from a feed supplier. Ruth sat at the office desk sorting receipts by lamplight. Nate placed the papers down, then hesitated. You still looking through those old records? Every chance I get. He shifted awkwardly. I probably shouldn't say this. Ruth looked up. Nate lowered his voice. A few years ago, Luke started losing money faster than anyone could explain. Bad seasons? That's what everybody thought. And you didn't? Nate rubbed his jaw. I just always found it strange that the numbers never matched the work. The room grew quiet. Before Ruth could ask another question, a shadow moved past the office window. Amos, walking slowly across the yard, watching. The next morning, Ruth returned to the ledgers. For hours, she compared invoices, feed orders, cattle sales, equipment purchases. One by one, patterns emerged. The same supplier, the same signatures, The same missing documentation, again and again and again. By noon, she no longer suspected. She knew. Amos had been stealing from the ranch for years, not through one large theft, through hundreds of small ones, amounts too small to attract attention, enough to slowly bleed Luke's business dry. Ruth gathered everything: copies, receipts, canceled orders, missing inventory reports. She arranged them carefully inside her tin box. When she finally carried the evidence to Sheriff Walter Kane, snow drifted across Main Street. The sheriff listened without interrupting. His weathered face revealed little. Only when she finished did he lean back in his chair. "You sure about this?" Ruth placed the final receipt on his desk. "I'm sure." The investigation moved quietly. For nearly 2 weeks, nobody said a word. Then came the winter cattle auction. Ranchers filled the sale yard. Wagons lined the road. Steam rose from horses in the cold morning air. Amos stood near the auction ring, speaking confidently to a group of buyers. Then Sheriff Kane arrived. 2 deputies followed. The conversations stopped. The sheriff unfolded several documents. Amos's face changed before a single accusation was spoken. Within minutes, the truth spread through the crowd. Fraudulent invoices, missing funds, false purchases, years of theft. Luke stood frozen. The evidence passed from hand to hand. Everything Ruth had uncovered, everything Amos thought would remain hidden. Amos looked toward her once, only once, then lowered his eyes. By sunset, he was gone. The ranch had been saved. The debt that haunted Luke for years suddenly made sense. For the first time in a long while, the future looked possible. Yet that evening, the house felt strangely empty. Because another date was approaching. The departure date written in the Cheyenne letter. Ruth stood in her room, folding clothes into her suitcase. Downstairs, she heard Luke working in the barn. Later, she heard wagon wheels. The sound continued for nearly an hour. When she finally stepped outside, she found him greasing axles beneath the lantern light. "The wagon needed work?" she asked. Luke looked up. His expression remained calm. "It'll be a smoother ride to the station." The station. Not if, not maybe. The station. Ruth felt something tighten inside her chest. Luke returned to tightening a bolt. The lantern flickered between them. He had saved the ranch. She had saved the ranch. Yet neither of them seemed able to save this moment. 2 nights later, snow drifted against the porch steps. The house sat quiet. Only the ticking of the clock filled the room. Ruth stood near the window, watching darkness settle across the valley. Luke sat across from her at the table. Neither touched the coffee growing cold between them. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. "If I go?" Luke looked up. She held his gaze. "If I go, will you be all right?" The question remained hanging in the quiet room. Luke did not answer. Not right away. The clock on the wall ticked softly. A log settled in the stove with a dull crack. Outside, snow drifted across the yard beneath a moon hidden behind clouds. Ruth waited. Luke stared into his coffee cup for several seconds before finally lifting his eyes. "No," he said quietly. The word surprised even him. Ruth did not move. Neither did he. For weeks he had measured every sentence, every glance, every moment. He had convinced himself that respect meant silence. Yet the truth had slipped out before he could stop it. "No," he repeated. "I wouldn't be all right." The room fell still. Luke looked down at his hands. Hands worn by rains, wire fencing, winters, and years of hard work. He had never found words easy, not the important ones. "I thought if I stayed out of the way," he began slowly, "you'd be free to make your decision." Ruth listened. "I thought asking you to stay would be selfish." A faint smile touched her face. Maybe it would have been. Luke almost smiled back. Almost. But the sadness remained. The next few days passed quietly. The departure date arrived with cold wind and a pale sky stretching across Iron Creek Basin. Luke loaded Ruth's suitcase into the wagon before sunrise. The same suitcase she had carried off the train months earlier. The same tin box rested beside it. Nothing about the morning felt dramatic. That somehow made it harder. The road to town wound between frozen fields and snow-covered fence lines. Neither spoke much. A hawk circled high above the valley. The wheels creaked steadily over the frozen ground. When Iron Creek Station appeared in the distance, Ruth felt her chest tighten. The train had not arrived yet. A handful of passengers stood on the platform. Steam drifted from the station chimney. Somewhere inside, a telegraph clicked steadily. Luke carried her suitcase to the wooden bench, then stepped back. For a moment, neither knew what to do. Everything practical had already been done. The ticket was purchased. The job waited in Cheyenne. The future stood only a train ride away. Ruth looked toward the tracks, then toward Luke. "You don't have to say goodbye yet." Luke nodded, but he still said nothing. The silence stretched. This time it felt different. Not protective, not careful, just unfinished. Finally, Luke removed his hat. Cold wind moved through his hair. I spent most of my life thinking I didn't need anyone. Ruth's eyes remained fixed on him. Luke swallowed. The station around them seemed to fade. The waiting passengers, the telegraph, the distant horses. All of it disappeared. I thought being alone made things simpler. His voice was steady, but barely. I thought if I expected less from people, I couldn't be disappointed. Ruth took a small step closer. Luke looked directly at her, the way he should have weeks earlier, months earlier. "I don't want you to leave." The words hung in the winter air, simple, honest. Nothing polished, nothing rehearsed. Ruth felt tears threaten for the first time since arriving in Wyoming. Luke continued, "I don't need a wife on paper." His voice lowered. "I don't need someone to cook meals." The train whistle sounded faintly in the distance. Still, he kept speaking. "I need the woman who brought light back into that house." Ruth's breath caught. Luke looked away briefly before finding the courage to continue. "The woman who fixed things nobody else noticed. The woman who saw what was happening to the ranch when I couldn't. The woman I look for every evening when I ride home." The approaching train grew louder. Neither of them turned toward it. Luke stepped forward. "Just one step. I need you, Ruth." No promise, no grand speech, no dramatic declaration. Only the truth. For several seconds, she said nothing. The train rolled into view beyond the bend. Steam rising. Steel wheels singing against the tracks. Everything she had wanted was waiting. Security. Opportunity. A fresh beginning. Yet when she imagined leaving, she did not see the city. She saw a ranch kitchen glowing in lamplight. A chipped coffee mug beside the stove. A man returning home covered in dust and snow. A place where she had slowly become part of the rhythm. Not because anyone demanded it, because she had chosen it. Ruth looked toward the arriving train, then back at Luke. A smile appeared. Small, certain. "I think," she said softly, "I've already found where I belong." Luke stared at her, not quite believing. The conductor called for boarding. Passengers began moving. Ruth did not. The train stopped, then eventually pulled away again. Without her. Luke released a breath he seemed to have been holding for months. Neither rushed forward. Neither needed to. The hardest thing had already happened. The truth had finally been spoken. 1 year later, the Bennett Ranch looked different. The debt was gone. The herd had grown. New fencing stretched across the northern pasture. A fresh coat of paint covered the barn doors. Ruth managed the accounts from the office. No missing pages. No hidden invoices. No secrets. People in town greeted her by name now. Sheriff Kane tipped his hat whenever he passed. Nate still claimed her bread was the finest in Wyoming. Even Clara Whitfield eventually stopped talking and quietly moved away the following spring. Late that autumn, Luke and Ruth stood inside the small wooden church overlooking the valley. Pastor Eli Mercer smiled as sunlight streamed through the windows. There was no grand celebration, just friends, neighbors, people who had watched the story unfold one quiet day at a time. Years later, Luke still returned home through the same gate, still crossed the same yard, still paused when he saw warm light glowing through the kitchen window. Inside, Ruth sat beside the stove reviewing ledgers while a kettle steamed gently nearby. The house was no longer cold, not because of the fire, because someone was there. Luke stepped inside. Ruth looked up. Their eyes met. A smile passed between them. Familiar, easy, earned. And in that simple moment lived the truth neither of them understood when a train first arrived in Iron Creek. It was never the storm, never the stolen money, never the letter from Cheyenne. The thing that changed everything was much smaller. Two lonely people finally stopped pretending they could carry the whole world by themselves. And maybe that's why this story lingers long after the final scene fades. Because if we're honest, most of us have been standing where Luke stood at some point in our lives. We tell ourselves we're fine. We keep working. We keep moving. We convince ourselves that needing someone is a weakness, and that carrying every burden alone is somehow a sign of strength. Or maybe you've been where Ruth was, facing a safer road, a simpler choice, while quietly wondering whether the place that feels like home is worth the risk. Life rarely gives us certainty. Most of the time it gives us people. And sometimes the greatest gift isn't finding someone who rescues you. It's finding someone who respects your freedom, sees your scars, and still chooses to stay. That's what Luke and Ruth discovered. Healing didn't arrive in a single moment. It arrived through shared meals, quiet evenings, difficult conversations, and the courage to speak the truth before it was too late. So before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think was the moment Luke and Ruth truly fell in love? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this bring you comfort after a long day, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more journeys waiting ahead, stories of second chances, enduring love, hidden strength, and the quiet ways people find their way back to one another. Until next time, take care of yourself, and don't be afraid to let someone walk beside you.